Okay, so we will be continuing our discussion on previous year questions, and in this video we will be taking up the topic phenomenology. Okay, so positivism we have already done, and interpretivism we have discussed, non-positivism we have discussed. So from non-positivism we are taking up the question phenomenology. Okay, so here what we'll do is I'll show you the question first which has been asked, and then we will look at what we need to proceed. Okay, so if you look at the question, phenomenological perspective in sociology reject many of the assumptions of positivism. You need to comment upon this. Now it's very simple. We have the template already. Any question, if they're asking about positivism, you will talk about the initial development of sociology, the positivist, and then talk about criticisms. And then towards the end, you will discuss about non-positivism also, and then only you will conclude. If they're asking about interpretivism, you start with positivism and then criticisms, and then interpretive sociology will give importance, and towards the end you'll talk about non-positivism, and then only you will conclude. Even if they're asking about non-positivism, you start with positivism and then interpretivism, and then towards the end you talk about what has been asked, phenomenology, ethnomethodology, other non-positivism, and then you will conclude, right? So here we have three different dimensions which we need to discuss. Like when we talk about positivism, it's the objective study of objective reality. So what you study is the objective reality. How you study? Objectively. So objective study of objective reality. Coming to the Weber interpretivism, you need to study objectively. How you study? Objectively. But what you study? Subjective meanings. So then this objective study of objective reality became objective study of subjective reality. Then comes phenomenology or non-positivism. Here, what you study? Subjective meanings. How you study? Subjectively. So subjective study of subjective reality. If you understood this, you have understood this complete topic of positivism and non-positivism. The conceptual part is very clear, right? So it's ultimately what matters is what to study and how you study. What you study and how you study is objective here, but what you study is subjective. How you study is objective in Weber, and when it comes to complete non-positivist, it's both subjective. So this is coming from major theoretical strands in research methodology, and this topic is actually the continuation of that bigger debate that we had, that is positivism and interpretivism. Now let's continue from there, and that is why I have given this flow: positivism, interpretivism, and then phenomenology or non-positivism. Now, see, phenomenology belongs to the broader interpretive tradition in sociology. So that is why Weber is considered to have bridged the gap between two, right? Weber comes in between. There is some element of positivism, some element of non-positivism. Now, phenomenology, it's completely a radical shift, right? Mainly, it emerged because of the criticisms of positivism, because what the positivists have believed, now all these things you need to write. Society can be studied scientifically, like nature, like natural science. But what phenomenologists will tell us, they strongly disagree to that. And their argument is human beings are not object. Like in Durkheim's case, you have seen he want to consider social facts as things like objects, but phenomenologist or non-positivist. But since the question is asked about phenomenologist, I'm talking specifically to that. So phenomenologist, it is not possible because human beings can think. Human beings have meanings, emotions. They interpret things and they can assign meanings, and the context is very important, and actively construct the social reality. So sociology cannot simply measure people statistically or by using numbers, and you cannot simply claim the complete understanding of reality. So this is the core philosophy when it comes to phenomenology, and that is completely conflicting also, right? So what UPSC asking specifically is how phenomenological perspectives rejects the assumptions of positivism. So what we need is, we'll keep focus on that, right? So this answer should not become a generic note on phenomenology. We also need to connect it with positivism. We also need to discuss the assumptions of positivism, and we need to see one by one the assumptions of positivism is getting negated or rejected, and that's extremely important. So we need to mention this as phenomenological critique of positivism, right? So this is how, that means you'll take up assumptions and you'll reject assumptions, and what phenomenology will do. So this question, you need to treat it as a phenomenological critique to positivism, right? So let's now directly get into the answer. I'll start with introduction, body, conclusion, like that. So first you need to, what I will tell first in the introduction. I hope you got the structure of the question. right? You understood the question also. You understood the demand of the question also. Now see, I start like this. Phenomenological perspective in sociology provide a unique understanding or unique lens to study social phenomena by emphasizing subjective experiences, meanings, emotions, interpretations, context, and socially constructed reality, and thereby rejecting many assumptions of positivism. So, there itself, you are bringing meanings, emotions, lived experiences, interpretation, etc. And then also you can define positivism. So, and then tell what are the assumptions or elements of positivism. You can say positivism emphasizes on external reality, objectivity, quantifiability, causal orientation, causal explanation, and universal laws, testability, etc. And laws should be made through scientific methods. So immediately you are bringing the contrast, and that contrast becomes very clearly visible also. So you have defined the elements of positivism and non-positivism in the definition itself, so that contrast is very much visible. Now we need to discuss one by one. What is phenomenology? Briefly explain that. So phenomenology, okay, in fact, you need to talk about those thinkers first, right? So mainly developed through Edmund Husserl, Alfred Schutz, Peter Berger, Thomas Luckmann, right? And then phenomenologists argue what that you need to discuss. That whatever you have learned from your mentor, your class notes, same thing. You don't want to, have a different understanding here. It's the same conceptual thing which you know. But what I write is what I've given to my mentees is reality is not simply out there objectively. Reality is experienced, and it's experienced through consciousness. It's experienced through interpretations and meanings and everyday interaction. It's a very important line. So what you can write is social reality is socially constructed, and that becomes the foundation of the entire critique of positivism. What I repeat, social reality is socially constructed. Just underline, just note down this line and underline this line. If you are getting a question on phenomenology, non-positivism, this line should be there. Social reality is socially constructed, or socially constructed reality. Now, now you need to come to the question and tell how phenomenology reject positivist assumption. This has become the core body of your answer, right? And this should be your major part. So far, you're telling the examiner, yes, I know the thing, and I'm coming to that. Now, this is a core part. So first discussion, the subjective reality versus objective reality. What is a positivist assumption and what is a phenomenological critique? I hope all of you can write it well. So positivist, what they do is they believe that society exists objectively independent of individuals. And you can mention Durkheim called it as social facts, and he wanted to treat social facts as things so that you can be completely detached and you can ensure absolute objectivity, which is something which is desirable by the positivist. What does that mean? Social reality can be measured externally when you treat it as things quantitatively, right? It can be quantified. So even the extreme abstract forms of social facts, Durkheim tried to quantify when he stressed on social facts need to be considered as things. Cool. Now, what is the phenomenological critique? What they do, they completely reject this. And what they argue, reality is experienced subjectively. Different individual may interpret the same social situation differently. For example, you can take any example, the idea of freedom that can carry different meanings for different section. For women, freedom may be different than workers. For them, freedom may be different than minorities. Minorities' freedom is different than workers' freedom. That will be different from women's freedom. That will be different from upper classes or middle classes or lower classes. So if you can give this, right, how it can carry different meaning for different sections, or how a different individual or different group interpret the same social situation differently. This is an excellent illustration, right? That means sociology must understand how people experience reality, not merely what you do is like measure in terms of some quantitative properties or parameters externally. How people experience reality is what more important for phenomenology. So that's the first point. Now, next one, the social construction of reality versus external determinism. You can bring in Berger and Luckmann here. So what Berger and Luckmann, that statement, I hope all of you know that we have already discussed in the class, and any mentor used to discuss this, it should be there. Any sociology course should have given this. Reality is socially constructed through interaction and shared meanings. So what phenomenologists argue, social order emerge from ongoing human interpretations. But what the positivist emphasizes on the larger structure, macro reality, and the influence of macro reality over the micro, or the society over individual, institutions, its influence, the external forces, the externality, generality, etc., that Durkheim have discussed as the characteristics of social facts. What phenomenology says, people actively create social reality and not merely react to the structures. They have their own meanings, their own interpretations, and based on that, they take their actions. And it's not merely based on, external reality, or they're not reacting to the structure. That is why different individuals react differently in the same structure, also in the social situation also. Very important conceptual difference that you need to give here. Next one, interpretation versus quantitative measurement. What is positivist view? They prioritize statistics. They give importance to surveys, quantification, numerical measurement, numbers, because what they're looking for is ultimately objectivity. They're looking for predictability, generalization, universal law, testability, reliability, validity. But when it comes to phenomenology, they completely reject it. Phenomenology emphasizes on interpretation. They look for lived experience. They look for meaning, emotions, consciousness. For example, a positivist may statistically measure poverty, below poverty line, above poverty line. But the phenomenologists study how poor people themselves experience humiliation, insecurity, and exclusion. So different dimensions will come when it comes to non-positivism. For example, the qualitative understanding of poverty, quantitative understanding of poverty. Absolute poverty, relative poverty, it's a classical example for this. Okay, then what is the next one? Contextual understanding and universal generalization. Universal generalization pertains to positivism. Contextual understanding pertains to phenomenology or non-positivism. So in positivism, they look for universal laws, which is applicable across the world. Broader generalization. Something, you make a theory with which you can generalize religion, you can generalize everything. And they're looking for the predictable patterns. But what phenomenology try to do, they reject this universalism completely. Everything is context specific. Caste, something which you will not see anywhere else other than India. So how can it can generalize? It can be universal, right? So they are looking for context specific understanding, culturally situated understanding, right? It depends upon the culture also, historically shaped as well. Therefore, the deep contextual understanding is more important than any abstract generalization when it comes to social reality. So, very important phenomenological critique to positivism. We can even give the example of caste, which I've mentioned. Next is the mechanical causality, which positivism talk about, and human consciousness, which non-positivists talk about. Positivists, in fact, they explain behavior through external causes, the macro influence, the structures, the measurable variables. But the phenomenologist will talk about humans are conscious, meaning producing beings, and people actively interpret situation around them before they take any action, right? So because of that itself, behavior cannot be reduced to any kind of mechanical causality, because they see things, they interpret the situation, and according to that, they act. And that's why different individuals act differently in the similar social situation. So how can a mechanical causality based on the situation is possible? It is not possible. Again, it is showing you very good analytical depth if you can mention this. Then the easiest one, quantitative and qualitative methods. So the positivist method, that is surveys, census, experiments, statistical correlation, these are quantitative methods. They are looking for quantifiable properties of a social phenomena because they want to look for objectivity and reliability, etc. Phenomenological method, if you see, it's in-depth interviews, participant observation, narratives, ethnography. Because this method is basically looking for or trying to capture the meanings, emotions, lived experience. But one is very easy to do, quantitative, but the other is slightly difficult to do. But that is more important when it comes to studying a social phenomena. And this is bringing a very important methodological distinction in your answer. Then you can also talk about detached objectivity, as positivists discussed, versus reflexivity. So positivism basically assumes the researcher can remain completely objective and detached, right? But phenomenologists outrightly reject it. And they argue researchers themselves are part of the social world that they study. And because of that itself, reflexivity is more important. What does that mean? Researchers have to remain aware of how their own perspective influence the interpretation. And you can also talk about Alfred Schutz's contribution, was taken for granted assumption, right? You can bring in Alfred Schutz separately because he's central to this. Schutz combines phenomenology with sociology, and he argued everyday social life was built upon this taken for granted assumptions. Very important. We are writing and mentioning this in many situations, so I hope you know all these. So people operate through common sense meaning in everyday life. Even we discuss the same in common sense also. Because of that itself, sociology have to study everyday consciousness, lived meanings, practical interpretations. So these are the things that you can mention over there. You can also talk about critique of positivist quantification. See, what a phenomenologist will tell us, quantification may simply, complex the human experience excessively. For example, if you try to, or a statistical data on migration, if you take statistical data on migration, it talk about income, it talk about employment, it talk about mobility and all those. But this is numbers, right? How can this capture the other dimensions of migration like loneliness, your identity crisis, the emotional dislocation, and the cultural alienation? So as a sociologist, we are looking for these dimensions, right? This is a very strong sociological explanation. Now, before you conclude, you also need to, we talk about phenomenologist, we talk about briefly positivism and interpretation also, bring in ethnomethodological linkage. That's a small enrichment to your answer. Though I know they have asked about phenomenology, but I told you why my students are scoring 290 plus. Nilesh Goyal, 293, national topper. Shubham, 296, national topper. These are the enrichment points. 0.5, 1 mark if you can improve in each of your answer. That is the one which is making that difference of 20, 30 marks. That's how you become 260 to 290 or 270 to 290. This is the difference. So phenomenology later influenced the ethnomethodology. And Harold Garfinkel you discuss. Harold Garfinkel studied how ordinary people create social order through everyday practices. Method of accounts you can mention, and that directly challenge the positivist assumption that order exists independently as an external structure. That's a very good advanced linkage. I know it's not asked, but one line is enough. That will suffice. But you have to mention ethnomethodology. That's a value addition here. Don't think that I'll stick to the question. You need to write this. This is an enrichment point. Now, you also need to write criticism of phenomenology. Though this is a question of phenomenological critique of positivism, don't ignore the negativity or criticism of phenomenology. That is when you can balance this. You need to maintain the balance. That shows your sociological maturity. The balance is required, right? Because a mature sociological answer should never become one-sided. We are not talking about any objective science. So phenomenology is also criticized. Excessive subjectivity that may reduce objectivity. Findings become very difficult to generalize. Large-scale structures may get neglected. You definitely get influenced by the religion can influence you, family can influence you, your society can influence you. Yes, you are the one who interpret and take action, but you have definitely an influence upon that. And scientific predictability is weak in this. They're not looking for it, but just for the sake of criticizing or to make a negative or to balance your answer, you're giving that. Now, finally, what you need to write in the modern context, can phenomenology and positivism complement each other? This is the section that makes your answer intellectually mature. This is how you and Nilesh Goyal is different, or Shubham and you will be different. You may score 260, that is easy. But these guys score 290 plus and becoming national toppers in sociology. That's the difference. Can this complement each other? Modern sociology, what they do, right? It's a methodological pluralism or combining both approaches. Because positivism, identifying pattern. Phenomenology explain meanings behind those patterns. Very important synthesis. So we need a thesis, we need a synthesis, antithesis and a synthesis. So this is how you bring in that. For example, a study on educational inequality. Okay, you can use statistical data to identify inequality and everything. That is quantitative, that is positivism. At the same time, you can use interviews to understand students' lived experiences of exclusion. That's an element of non-positivism. So that is something which you can write, means very, very much like an applied sociological example you are giving. Also, if it is 20 marker, give a contemporary relevance. One more linkage, modern linkage, if you can add. In contemporary society, which is based on identity politics, migration, mental health issues, digital interactions, emotional alienation. These phenomenological approach have become increasingly more important because they can understand how people subjectively experience social reality. That is very good contemporary relevance you're adding to the answer. After this is how, these are the things. If you can write, 60% of what I've discussed, you will get 80% mark. Conclude in a balanced and sophisticated manner. You will say phenomenological perspective reject many assumptions of positivism by emphasizing subjective meanings, emotions, motivations, interpretation, consciousness, and socially constructed reality over positivist elements like objectivity, quantification, universal laws, testability, etc. And what is the final synthesis? But still, however, contemporary sociology increasingly recognize both phenomenological insight and positivist rigor, or quantitative and qualitative, or scientific and humanistic, or macro and micro, or inductive and deductive, are necessary for a fuller, deeper, wider understanding of social phenomena. Excellent concluding line. Now, guys, look at the question. Now you observe what you have written. So I hope you have taken down the structure which I've given you. At least the skeleton is with you. Now you compare. Now you think about this. How many of you write in this way? How many of you will add or structure your answer like this? And now think about you as the evaluator. Seeing the structure itself, don't you think that you deserve 16 mark out of 20? At least 15 mark? At least if you have the structure, because that person who's evaluating, now you know what is actually it is, right? You know about positivism, you know the language, you know the positivism assumptions, you know how to criticize, the other dimensions and everything. And finally, you have given a very matured answer also. So if you see this question, it's actually questioning whether a human society can ever be understood exactly like nature. And that's the deeper philosophical issue here. And you have solved that issue forever, right? So phenomenologist basically telling sociologists, to the other sociologists or sociology, that humans are conscious, humans have meanings, and that meanings matter, very important. And reality is interpreted. And lived experience cannot always be reduced in terms of quantifiable numbers. And that's why phenomenology become one of the most powerful critique of positivist sociology. That's what you have written in your answer. And this is how it has to be, right? So I see you in the next video with another question. If you would like to join our mentorship program or classes or test series, get in touch with us. See you there.